So Reuben King was convicted of selling firearms, of being an unregistered or unlicensed firearms dealer, facing a lot of jail time. What state? Well, what stage of the proceedings are you at right now?
On appeal.
He is currently not. He's where is he now?
He got probation. We started representing him at the sentencing stage, and the original recommendation was 3 years in prison, and the judge recognized the issues that we raised and reduced it to probation.
all right. And so you're appealing it, even though probation has come and gone, I presume.
Oh no, the probation is like 3 years. But the main it was really the big constitutional questions lurking in his case, and he went along with the appeal because of the broader consequences of the case. Generally, the Amish don't seek legal relief or legal remedy because of their religious traditions, but in this context, it was permissible because of the broader impact it would have on the rest of the country. And the statements the government made in its opposition on the appeal reveal just how significant this case is for the Second Amendment liberties in America.
So I mean, I have an understanding of the Second Amendment constitutional issues, but I mean, flesh them out for those who might not appreciate it. This is a man who's selling his own. This is what we would call a private sale of a firearm. He's not making it his primary business. Their argument is that any private sale basically is going to make you into a gun dealer, which means that you need to get licensed by the feds.
Yeah, and in particular here problematic because they require as a condition without exception a photograph, and the Amish don't do photographs as part of their religious tradition, and so consequently, he couldn't apply, and they didn't provide any accommodation for him to apply. And what they told him was if his general business was selling guns, then he had to register. He's like, well, I farm every day. So no, gun selling guns is not my daily business. My daily business is this big farm I operate here. So that he thought that was that. Some undercovers went back in and decided to charge him with being a commercial sales, a license, someone that required a license.
Mm-hmm.
And so one issue is whether he could even be required to have a license. The law is so vague about that's one of our challenges, that it's void for vagueness, because nobody would be on fair notice as to who is required to be licensed when even the ATF can't agree on who it is that's required. They described it themselves as saying there's no bright line rule. It's kind of the definition of void for vagueness. For those that don't remember, the principle is that the law has to give you fair notice of what you can go to prison for. And if there's any doubt about it, they can't put you in prison for it under the rule of lenity for criminal statute interpretation. And the other aspect here was our argument is this violated the Second Amendment because there's no federal gun law registration of any kind until the 1930s. So if you go back to when our Constitution was founded, you won't find any federal laws for a century and a half of any custom and practice or history and tradition of limiting who could sell a gun, who could buy a gun, and who could possess a gun. So our argument is there is no history and tradition of federal law regulating this, requiring a licensing in the first place, despite the rule being so vague that it can entrap all kinds of people on top of it. And the only question is selling or buying a gun protected under the Second Amendment? Well, it almost has to be, right? Because if not, if you have no Second Amendment right to buy a gun and no Second Amendment right to sell a gun, what good is a Second Amendment right to possess something you can neither buy nor sell?
Let me play devil's advocate. They'll say you have the right to buy a gun if you buy it from a registered federal dealer, and you have the right to own it if you've bought it from a registered dealer.
But that only goes to the second aspect. So the first aspect is, does the Second Amendment protect it? Because if it does protect it, then they have to show that the regulation or restriction on purchases or sales fits within the history and tradition of federal registration laws. They know they can't win on the second part because there were no federal registration laws until the 1930s. So the only way they can win is if the courts decide, Well, the states were imposing these restrictions, except the Second Amendment wasn't applied to the states until the Civil War and the incorporation to the 14th Amendment. So that has no analogy to what was the interpretation of the Second Amendment as to the federal government, which is applicable only at the time of the founding. And even then, they've just got a scattered shot set of laws that aren't consistent and the rest. For the most part, gun sales were not controlled by the government, whether in terms of purchases or in terms of selling. So all of these laws are foreign to the history of the Constitution and the general rule, Second Amendment. So what's their main argument? Their main argument is you have absolutely no right in America to buy a gun. You have absolutely no right in America to sell a gun. The Second Amendment only protects possession. It does not protect purchases, and it does not protect sales, which means, yeah, you have the right to have a gun. You just have no means to get it. That's their interpretation of the Second Amendment. They said that explicitly to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And that's why I've been telling people that Reuben King's case is much bigger than Reuben King.
They say you do not have the right to acquire it unless it's acquired from a federally licensed dealer.
No. You don't have a right, period. This is purely a privilege. You have no right to ever buy a gun, according to the U.S. government. You have no right to ever sell a gun, according to the U.S. government. They're saying Second Amendment doesn't protect that. The right to bear arms only protects the right of possession. That the Second Amendment has nothing to do with the purchase or sale of a gun. That's their position.
All right, now, but no judge is going to say that you can't buy or sell a gun. They're going to say
the district court judge pretty much said exactly that.
Well, unless you're registered as a federal.
No. He said there's no right. So in other words, the registration is purely ancillary. You don't look. You never analyze the registration rules. It's, do you have a Second Amendment right? Does a Second Amendment apply to gun sales? If it doesn't apply to gun sales, it's just a privilege, right? There's no right. So that's it. Now, you won't be criminally prosecuted under the existing law if you go through a licensed seller. But what that means is Congress could just ban the sale of it altogether, not require any licensing. Because what's important here is they're not saying that this method of registration is permissible under the Second Amendment. They're saying the Second Amendment doesn't apply, period. And if we wanted to, we can ban all sales of all guns to everybody everywhere.
Assume that they're going to come down with the reasonable middle ground, which is going to be you can have private sales for up to, if you don't exceed your primary income.
The only way you can get to that, though, is you have to first say the Second Amendment applies, and then you would say, is this regulation and restriction, this condition on purchase and sales, consistent with the history and tradition of gun law, federal gun laws? They're trying to argue federal and state gun laws. You only get to that if the first aspect is met. They know they have a problem with a bunch of their current rules and restrictions. Their fallback position is, hey, it still won't apply to Reuben King for reasons A, B, C, and D.
Yeah.
But they put that aside for the moment. The bigger legal precedent they're trying to establish here is there's no Second Amendment right, period.
But from a practical perspective, this was a criminal case. So was it done by a judge or was it done by a jury, the conviction?
Both a judge and a jury.
Okay.
But the first part was, does the Second Amendment apply? Because then you turn to, is this particular restriction consistent with the Second Amendment?
And they didn't even get past the first part, which was, no, the Second Amendment does not apply to the purchase and sale of firearms.
Correct.
Huh.
I mean, they have additional arguments on the other part, but their goal was to use this case to make a precedent on the first. And that's why the ATF was trying to expand into making all private sales you had to get registered for, which a federal court in Texas enjoined, because it said you didn't even go through the proper APA process for that. But the big first issue, because this has never been explicitly ruled on by any court. The courts have suggested our position is correct, that yes, the Second Amendment has to protect purchase and sales, because if it doesn't, the Second Amendment is dead. Your right to possess a gun you can't get is worthless and useless. And that's been the logic other courts have noted, but they've never ruled on the specific question. This case presents that specific question clearly. They have to make that decision first before they do the analysis as, is this restriction permissible under the Second Amendment because it fits within the history and traditions under the Bruin decision. They don't want to get there because even if it's not this case, there'll be other cases they lose where they can't establish that their restriction on purchase and sales governs it. The case the Supreme Court has addressed to date hasn't been purchase and sale cases. It's been permits to possess. And the new Biden administration, the new Democratic approach is, okay, we can't win on that anymore on controlling possession. Let's just ban sales. Let's just ban purchases. And thereby we eviscerate your Second Amendment anyway.
What are the chances that the court says the question will arise later on, but for the time being, he's satisfied his
have
role?
to get to that first analysis before they can do the rest. So they're going to have to address this question.
Okay, now I absolutely understand not your fixation, but why this was such an important case to you from the beginning, because we've been talking about it for a long time.